It's State of the Water, where we bring policymakers, movers and shakers from across the country to discuss issues on the national level that impact you locally here in Hampton Roads. I'm your host, award-winning Dr. Eric Claville. Sundays at 1:30 on Blazing Hot 91. State of the Water, where policymakers, movers, and shakers meet. An initiative of the Center for African American Public Policy at Norfolk State University. Good afternoon, Hampton Roads. It's election 2020, and President Donald J. Trump concluded the Republican National Convention with accepting the nomination for the Republican Party once again. The overwhelming message was, you will not be safe in a Biden America. Also, the convention highlighted several African Americans and their stories of why a Trump presidency will be better for America, but what is the plan for Black America? You're listening to The State of the Water, and I'm your host, Dr. Eric Claville. Today, to help us understand these and other important issues, we have Norfolk's own Adam Roosevelt, CEO of SEM North America, and the former candidate for the Republican Party for the House of Delegates District 49. Mr. Roosevelt, thank you so much for joining us today on State of the Water.
Thank you, Director Claville, for having me, and also the Center for African American Public Policy at NSU. Really appreciate the work you all do and look forward to talking with you all today.
Thank you so much. You know, listen, when I introduced you, I kind of gave a small snapshot of your position and your former running for the House of Delegates, but I really didn't do you just service. I want our audience to understand just exactly who you are and how proud Norfolk should be of you. Can you tell us a little bit about your position as CEO of North America, SEM North America?
Sure. So I am an alum of Norfolk, born in Chesapeake, actually, and spent quite a bit of time growing up there, and, came out, went to the U.S. military, and effectively now today I'm the CEO of SEM North America. My day-to-day job is to engage industry. I do a lot of work with foreign partners, U.S. government, and my job is to grow the corporation, focusing on eco-technology and deploying that as disruptive as possible to the market. I deal with a lot of different corporations. Right now we're working on closing major contracts and deals with SpaceX. A lot of you all out there know Elon Musk, working with major corporations like Boeing and Huntington Ingalls, America's #1 shipbuilding manufacturer. So on a day-to-day, my job is to do all the good things that CEOs do in terms of growth, capture, and execution.
And not only that, now are you making moves and being a major player in this very emerging technology. But you're under 30 years old, I think, right?
28 years old. Yeah.
So that young, being able to step in that position and really impact not just that particular market, but also our environment as a whole. What are some of the things that we should know here in Norfolk that's on the horizon with SEM North America?
Well, I would like to share that, a large part of my focus, given the economic downturn impacts due to COVID-19, has been realigning our strategy to integrate with today's America. That means pulling us back from the reliance on other countries and making sure that the American industry, predominantly the veteran-owned companies, the minority businesses, are replacing the dependencies from China, so that we can compete with large corporations. And what's on the rising, again, is really closing contracts with SpaceX so that all the assets deployed to space, we have a piece of the economic pie, and just doing the same thing for our aerospace assets with the defense industry and closing those contracts by 2021, Q1 is an aggressive objective, but that's what we're aiming, and I want everybody to stay tuned because obviously we're going to help move the pendulum forward for creating more jobs in Virginia and supporting where need be around the state Commonwealth.
Wonderful. Can you tell us all about your time in the military and how that actually helped to shape your philosophies and where you are now and how you're operating in the position of CEO?
Sure. It's a great question, actually. And 9 years in the United States military, world traveled, spent a lot of time overseas with the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. I was also in bed with a lot of the war campaigns, so counterinsurgency efforts, and that opened my perspective largely, cementing my commitment to patriotism, cementing my commitment to giving back to the community. And the core tenets of the United States military, some of which are courage, dedication, loyalty. That built the foundation for my leadership style, a spirit of core, and building the teamwork necessary to accomplish those objectives. Everything in the U.S. military does not constitute who I am as a person, but it is the core of who I am. So today, now, I execute the same way I would in the military. Discipline is always important. Rules, compliance, making sure that I follow the ethos that I've established in my corporation, and then effectively working with my employees and team members to, have an organizational culture that is fair and just for all populations of people. And we help to develop those leaders to then leave our organization or become partners with us so that they can also stand on their own 2 feet. And that's all about developing the leader from each generation to the next, and that's what we're focused on.
Awesome. And for our listeners, for those of you out there that want to learn more about Mr. Roosevelt and what he's doing at SEM, there was a wonderful article written in Black Enterprise and Forbes as well about what he's doing. And again, at such a young age and being such a presence in that space and then emerging technology. So again, congratulations on your selection. And we definitely know that you're going to move that company and the Commonwealth in a positive direction as far as that goes. Now, it's election 2020, and I want to segue because not only have you had a phenomenal military career, and thank you for your service, that helped to shape your core values and philosophies, and not only are you actually in the space of business, but you also had a stint in politics.
Oh, that's correct.
Can you tell us about what made you decide to run for the 49th District House of Delegates in 2017, and why as a Republican?
Great question, and I'll just identify with the truth. And the truth is, I grew up in Norfolk, and I think a lot of people from Norfolk understand, at least from the time I was there before the regentrification effort, that there were not a tremendous amount of opportunities, large in part because of gangs, economic disadvantages. And, I always wanted to look out to the future, establishing myself as a leader who could eventually come back and contribute to, not just the state, not just my community, but the globe as a whole. So what really helped me shape my decision was join the U.S. military on the front lines, having deployed to war in Afghanistan, and looking at the man to the left and right of me and realizing that was the American piece of me that reminded me of why it was so important for me to be successful, to save lives, to give back, and develop the next generation of people. The Republican philosophy has always been one of mine, primarily because as I was in the U.S. military, and you probably hear this a lot across the military, we economically are taken care of. We get raises each year. Then there's the question of how much government involvement is appropriate. So the second thing, I am a very big fan of capitalism. I believe that economies are best well suited to evolve and be more competitive when there's a lot of people competing to innovate. And I think that that's very critical. And limited government. I've been a rebel, and my parents will tell you I've been a rebel since I was a kid. So I believe that the rebellion in me has always been there and has really made me who I am today. And I believe that the people are essentially the part of America, and the government works for the people, and limited government is vital and important to the furtherance of our objectives as a citizen here in the United States. And that's the core reason why I believe that the Republican Party was the party for me. But again, I have bipartisan tendencies to work across the lines to develop solutions for the American people.
757-823-9110. That's 757-823-9110. We're here talking about the Republican National Convention and the plan for the Black community. We have with us Adam Roosevelt, CEO of SEM North America and former Republican candidate for the 49th District House of Delegates. Now, Adam, as an African-American, a young African-American, and a Republican, what is your perspective as to the effectiveness of the current Trump administration, and more specifically as it relates to the Black community?
It's a great question, and definitely two perspectives. I'll say first that the data is critical. Being a person of business inclinations and also a person who's pursuing my master's in business administration, I can't make any decisions without data. I will say that a lot of the talking points that came down from the White House that have been consistent with the president have focused primarily on restoring the American dream with the 2016 RNC platform, which essentially is the 2020 platform for the Republican Party. The White House has released, their agenda, but again, it's centered on rebuilding the economy and creating jobs. I think that's been important. So the data proves that 7 million jobs have been created, and this is prior to the pandemic, which I believe personally, the second part of your question, is that this data statistic proves that there is an inherent plan for social mobility for disadvantaged minority populations. The next thing I would also add is opportunity zones. Senator Tim Scott and a lot of members of Congress working across the aisles have worked on opportunity zones, and I came from an opportunity zone, and there's surely a lot more out there across the United States, but $75 billion, from private capital raised for these opportunity zones, to help close the wealth gaps for, again, disadvantaged populations, going through the legislation. And there's been a large focus also within the administration on education. We may have seen the HBCU push in 2017. The president signed an executive order on the White House initiative to promote excellence and innovation at our HBCUs. I think that was critical. And then the last 2 points I will say is under the education piece is the school choice. I think it's important for the American parent to be able to choose where to send those kids. And one large piece, I think, is a segue to criminal justice reform with the First Step Act. And those are just some of the things that I've kind of touched base on, but I'm happy to answer any additional questions as fit.
Sure, and you brought up some very good points that are important, not just to the Black community, but also to America as a whole. Because I know, as you've seen in your tours overseas and also from your traveling in the business community, in order for any country, to succeed, you have to have job growth. You have to have good education. And communities have to have the ability to stand on their own. So do you think that these policies that the White House and the Trump administration have championed, have they gone far enough? And if not, what would you recommend in addition to that?
I don't think that we've accomplished what we've set out to accomplish under any administration. I think that every administration has their objective, and we as a people have our view on how that objective should be carried out and how we can quantify whether or not we've actually moved forward as a people. And I would say, again, the data is going to be critical, but what I would like to see, me personally, as not just a Republican, but an American, a person who is of African-American descent, is I'd like to see more African-Americans in positions of authority. I'd like to see more African-Americans potentially being evaluated to be the Secretary of Defense, the Assistant Secretary, and the same thing across the United Nations, as well as, seeing these leaders, the genius that we have, being really capitalized on through positions of authority, through federal government institutions or through private sector engagement, and appointing these people, our people, to positions, provided they have the skill sets, but give them a fair chance, one, using legislation, two, recommendation networks, and three, leveraging the very powers that are within these networks that everybody knows exist. We deserve a piece of that, and I think that legislation could effectively help us out tremendously if we look at the whole taxonomy of the problem.
You mentioned that it's about data is critical, but we know in election cycles is all about optics. And one thing about this convention, there were a lot of African Americans, as a matter of fact, famous, prominent, and those that, quote unquote, rose up from the ashes of some bad situation in their lives that spoke at the RNC. How do you think that played with the African American community as a whole and also within the Republican Party?
Great question. I would say I don't know if it had the impact that it intended to have. I think that because we have two very strong forces going head-to-head at each other at this moment, there's a movement that is occurring. The Black Lives Matter movement is a very powerful force. There isn't a lot, from what I've seen, there isn't a lot of capacity to hear the other side. And that may be on both sides of the aisle. So when we showcase celebrities, which we believe strategically will access the African-American viewership or even the loyalty bank, I'm not sure personally if that resonates well with the African diaspora, the population of the voting bloc of Africans. I just don't think that that's the way I would do it, and that's my criticism on what we can potentially remove as a strategic tool and maybe put some different approaches on how we will access the American voting bloc, particularly the minority. So I didn't agree with it. but it has to happen. They have to have some representation. I just don't think that that was the best way to convey it. I would have done things a bit differently, personally, given the time that we're in.
757-823-9110. 757-823-9110. We're talking about the Republican National Convention and also the Republican Party and their plan for the African American community. Are we represented in the Republican Party like we should? Should we engage the Republican Party more or just as much as we engage the Democrats? Call in and let us know your thoughts. 757-823-9110. Adam, you mentioned African Americans in position of authority. And with this current Trump administration, we see the highest ranking or high-profile African Americans, Dr. Ben Carson, of course, who's over HUD. What other positions, or what do you think has stopped the Trump administration from putting forth more African Americans in those very high-profile positions?
That's a great question, and I'll share some information with you. I was one of the individuals that was going through the process to effectively be an assistant secretary at the Department of Homeland Security. I had to go through a variety of hoops and effectively give a tremendous amount of energy to submit myself as a candidate. Having gone through the process, there were a lot of barriers that were in place that effectively were not in the best interest of moving, I would say, any application forward. As it pertained to African Americans, I never was able to discover the real reason why there were not a tremendous amount of African Americans in the Trump administration. But I can tell you this now, that it was not the fact that the president was not interested. There were people at the operational and tactical level who were running their own plays, and I think that goes along the lines of why they put this message out of draining the swamp. And I'm not a big fan of using those type of words because I like to keep my professionalism, but in some way, shape, or form, it does exist that there are a variety of power struggles at the operational and tactical levels, and the president being at a strategic level. You know, obviously they need to meet their quotas. They need to have more African Americans, but those decisions are actually happening at the department agency level where the heads exist, and they're bringing in their people from, you know, former jobs and people that they trust, and you're going to see a group of people associated with the power bank that they're used to working with. So we're carrying a lack of diversity and inclusion from past job experience, past administrations, and we're just continuing to pick up this problem and we're not solving it. So that would be what I think it's attributable to. It's just the fact that the mechanisms to hire us is not in place and they're not taken into deep consideration because the power blocks are controlling the decisions.
Now, as it relates to the president himself, and you mentioned Black Lives Matter movement and the shootings of unarmed African Americans and their confrontations and with the police force, do you think that the president is going far enough or his administration is addressing these very important issues of African Americans? And if not, what would you recommend to the administration to do?
Great question. I will say the president is in a position where he has to make a decision. This is where I'll put my political hat on. You know, you always take the probability assessment of what will happen if a decision is made, the actions that I take. Will it give me a return on my investment? And the return on investment from a president's perspective, not that I speak for the president, but as a politician, is will I be able to gain more votes? Before you gain more votes, you have to control and maintain your base. That's rule number one in politics. Moving forward, there's a problem with the current movement. And it's not the movement itself. It's what's been able to happen alongside the movement. I agree with the protests, the peaceful protests. And I understand that America has a history of violence. So if things need to be done, I understand that. This is not new to the American people. But now we're in a situation where there are innocent people being hurt, the question of Antifa and so forth. So now it puts the president in a situation where the BLM flag is being misrepresented by actions and activities in the streets that are heinous activities that are effectively burning cities down. The economics are being impacted. And then, you know, you have to get more money from the government. So Trump is looking at this from a variety of different aspects that one has to get him reelected. What can he do at this point? And this is where it gets very difficult and controversial, even from my perspective, is he must probably focus primarily on law and order. Because I don't believe that even if we sit down across the table, that the other side will listen truthfully. I think there are people within the social class of the African-American movement or the BLM organization that are more prone to engaging in intellectual engagement. But large in part, what we're seeing is an umbrella of an activity that's being misrepresented by the heinous activities. So I think the president's going to stay where he's at on the Blue Lives Matter piece. Does not mean that he doesn't care about African Americans. It's just a safer marketing pitch before an election campaign result where he has to cement and hold the base, because I don't believe that there's going to be a large part of exodus from the Democratic Party to the Republican Party, given the force of the BLM movement right now. My personal opinion.
Yeah, and from a political standpoint, I understand what you're saying. You have to look at the larger picture. You know, what is the outcome for you? And his outcome is to get reelected. But from the law and order pitch you mentioned, you know, that speaks from a past of racism, that speaks from a past of white supremacy, that speaks from a past of the old Southern strategy in appealing to the old America, you know, before the 60s civil rights legislation. Do you think that the president risks being seen, and even more so, identified as a racist if he continues down this line?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I can tell you that, you know, being a part of a campaign, we have people who select words, and the word sequence and structure could really impact you cognitively and how you receive it. There were a tremendous amount of campaigns that have gone through, you know, the realignment of a campaign slogan because the American people receive it well. The law and order slogan, if you will, the objective under that slogan, you know, it essentially depends on where you come from in America.
Adam,
you know, I was...
Very quickly, we have a caller on the line. We're going to come back to that.
Yeah, that's a great question. And I can tell you that, you know, being a part of the campaign, we have people who select words. And the words...
Hello, caller?
Yes, hi. Good afternoon.
Yes, you're on Stay in the Water. What's on your mind?
Well, this is Dr. Meredith Velasco. I would like to ask Mr. Roosevelt, being that he is a young man and he has dealt with a lot of things across the lines with the Republican, how would he be able to bridge the gap, because there's so many divides with economics and unemployment? How would he, as a young male African-American, be able to bridge the gap between the parties so that we can move this country forward?
Thank you so much, caller. That's a phenomenal question. Mr. Roosevelt, the caller asked, how could you, as a young African-American male CEO in the Republican Party, bridge that economic gap?
It's a great question, and here's what I will offer up. You know, me as a strategic business owner, I'm very focused on establishing family offices. I believe that family offices are a way to, one, close the economic gap, but also to assure ourselves through generational power and economics that we can pass this down through family office chains. Most people are not aware of the family office aspect of worlds, but I will tell you, in Dubai, in the Middle East, even in, you know, the families that have tremendous amount of capital, these are what you consider family offices that establish generational wealth over time, and it assures your position as a family going forward. It's my personal way of doing things. I belong to a family office overseas, and that's how I've been able to expand at a very high accelerated rate with business development and capture efforts. So I would offer that one to potentially bridge the gap and cement us the power and the economics that we need long term.
Awesome. Can we now? I want to go back to that law and order discussion that we were having. You know, is this a pull from the old Southern strategy of trying to get that America back and appealing to the America pre-1960?
No, I don't think that's it. I just, personally, it's like rugby. One side of the field has force, the other side of the field has force. You have a movement that is going to work on defunding the police. Then you have a movement that is saying we can't defund the police. We have to use equal force on the other side of the messaging strategy. So, no, I don't think that. I think as African Americans, we understand that we've been in pain for 400 years. And then they're racist. They're still continuing to be institutionalized racism. It still exists. But I think the president decided to use and maintain that campaign slogan, or the objective under this is primarily because it's well known, it's well received, the base understands it, and if you change the messaging a couple months before the election, you risk some miscommunication and messaging to align your base. And that's what I think. He's going with what's been known, what's been received, and what is, the status quo of how people look at law and order, personally.
And you also mentioned earlier that there was extremists from both sides. On the right, the white supremacists, and then on the left, what's called anarchists. That's the term that's been utilized. And, there have been reports that each side in the middle, the Black Lives Matter movement and those of law enforcement, are saying, there is that middle ground that we can come together and talk. But I think America is captivated by these extremes. How can we refocus our attention on that middle ground?
Economics is the only answer at this point. I think that capital and economics is so critical right now, and I think it would solve a tremendous amount of our problems because it opens up doors of opportunities for us to, one, level the playing field. African Americans investing in America's infrastructure through modernization, commitments, and so forth, to have equity, the ability to go into a boardroom and sway a venture capitalist, private equity, a hedge fund, start your own hedge fund. It really boils down to the economics of the African American people and how well off we are in comparison to other populations around the world and even in the United States. And that's what I would say on my particular point for that one.
And you mentioned economics and also in democracy. It's about voting. And one great thing about America, well, there's many great things, but one great thing about our system is that you have one man, one vote. And there's been a lot of discussion this election cycle as to will my vote count? Do you think the administration is moving in the right direction as it relates to the post office and the changes that are taking place? Or do you think there's an exaggeration from the other side?
That is a very good question. And I used to be a poll watcher. Actually, in 2017, I was a poll watcher.
Oh, wow.
And I actually witnessed, a lot of issues at the polls where, for example, we had people who, were from the Middle East and they would have their garb on and the election officer would not check the ID with the face. That's just one small issue with verifying voters who are at the polls. Then there were issues where voter intimidation is a problem. With the mail-in votes, there could be a problem. It's very difficult to tell how big of a problem it will be without the data. Obviously the precautionary measures are being taken to ensure a fair and right election, if you will. But I do think that there is always a risk inherent with a new strategy. To the degree of that, I'm not sure, but there's definitely room for, some issues should we not think about the fact that people can manipulate these things. And there could be a new issue there. So, again, we do need to innovate as a nation. We do need to think outside the box to allow for more seamless voting for our senior citizens and so forth. But we're going to really need to sit down at the table and figure out what is the most risk-adverse option for us as a people, given the divide is so far between the Republicans and the Democrats. People are willing to do whatever it takes to see their candidate win, and we just can't risk any more further divide due to an issue like this if it decides to go forward.
Adam Roosevelt, Norfolk native, CEO of SEM North America. Thank you so much for being here with us on State of the Water. If you have, in the last 30 seconds, if you have any closing comments for our audience.
Sure. So I would just say, we have to climb to the mountaintop as a people, and I think we do that as working together. We have to leverage our intellect and establish global family office resources within the African diaspora to access that wealth for us, for our people. And we have a voting power that is very strong. We have a buying purchasing power of $3.9 trillion, across the minority markets. And if we work together, which I know we will have to, we'll be able to accomplish more goals as a people and leverage our genius to push our people across the line. And that's in America and around the world. So I appreciate your time, and I look forward to working with you all. And just God bless you and your families during this trying time.
Thank you so much, Adam. We enjoyed having you.
Thank you.
Well, on State of the Water, we promise to bring movers and shakers, policymakers from both sides to talk about these important issues. And that's what we've been doing. We understand that we have a choice to make in 2020, not just as president, but a choice to make down the line. So I encourage all of you, research the issues for yourself, find out what's true, what's not true, and cast your vote the way that you believe America should go. This is State of the Water, Norfolk State University, Center for African American Public Policy. I'm your host, award-winning Dr. Eric Claville, and we'll see you next Sunday. It's State of the Water, where we bring policymakers, movers and shakers from across the country to discuss issues on the national level that impact you locally here in Hampton Roads. I'm your host, award-winning Dr. Eric Claville. Sundays at 1:30 on Blazing Hot 91. State of the Water, where policymakers, movers, and shakers meet. An initiative of the Center for African American Public Policy at Norfolk State University.